Greeks had known about the oracle in Siwah for hundreds of years, and they identified Ammon, the Egyptian/Libyan god, with their own god, Zeus. So even before Alexander set off on his pilgrimage, he would have had some fairly precise knowledge of the oracle and how it operated. We're told that Alexander wanted to visit the oracle because of its reputation for infallibility, and also because Perseus and Heracles, to whom he was related, had visited the shrine as well. He wanted to equal the fame of those two heroes, and just as legend had it that somehow they were descended from Zeus, he also felt some kind of lineal connection to Zeus and wanted to get more precise information about that possible connection. Now, some modern scholars have tried to explain Alexander's visit to Siwah in political or pragmatic terms. But the visit to Siwah was a long, difficult, and even dangerous journey. Alexander never would have made such a journey unless he had a real passionate interest in asking the oracle questions that he wanted to find out the answers to. To begin his journey, Alexander sailed down from Memphis to Lake Meroeotis. There, he was greeted by representatives from the Greek city of Cyrene on the coast of what's now Libya. The representatives brought him gifts and asked him for peace and to visit their city. The Cyrenean envoys may have been sent to Alexander to help solidify the position of their own government, which was facing some kind of civil unrest. For the moment, Alexander declined their invitation, but the envoys may have unwittingly planted in Alexander's mind the seed of an idea about conquest to the west. But for the moment, that would have to wait, because Alexander was really interested in pushing on to the oracle. So Alexander pushed on westward to the city of Paraetonium, or modern Mersa Matruh. From there, he went to the village called Apis and then turned southward to begin the 200-mile journey down through the desert to the oasis of Siwah. This was the truly dangerous and difficult part of the journey, and several of Alexander's contemporaries, including Callisthenes, Aristobulus, and Ptolemy, left accounts of it. During the first couple of days of the journey, the conditions were bearable. But soon after that, they came across deep and high dunes of sand, and they ran out of water. Suddenly, up in the sky, a big black cloud appeared, and from the cloud, there was a rainburst, and they had abundant water. Arrian tells us that Alexander was happy to attribute that sudden cloudburst to none other than Zeus Ammon. After that, however, Alexander's party got totally lost. It was saved, according to Ptolemy, when two snakes suddenly appeared, went out in front of the Macedonians, and led them both to the oracle and back, hissing all the way. Aristobulus, supported by Callisthenes, tells a different story. It was two crows that suddenly appeared, flew out in front of the Macedonian army, and guided them to the oracle and back. Although we may be skeptical about such miraculous rescues, sudden cloudbursts, snakes, and crows are not unknown in either the Egyptian or Libyan deserts. Ptolemy's focus on the snakes may be explained in terms of his own political agenda. His account of this journey was committed to papyrus years afterward, when he was first satrap and then king of Egypt. Snakes were considered to be sacred in Egyptian society. For instance, a snake, a cobra, known as the uraeus, which was visualized as the eye of Ammon, is seen rearing up on the crown of pharaohs in order to give the pharaohs protection. Now, snakes may have led Alexander, Ptolemy, and the rest of their members of the party to the oracle and back. But it was pretty convenient for Ptolemy to be shown such divine favor very early on. And we have to remember that the favor of the Egyptian gods might be helpful to someone who was essentially a foreign ruler in Egypt. As far as Aristobulus' and Callisthenes' story about the crows is concerned, what's interesting about that is that if the crows appeared in Callisthenes' account, it has to mean that it wasn't displeasing anyway to Alexander. Callisthenes never would have included a story in his official court history which displeased Alexander. So I think one way of understanding the story that Callisthenes tells is that Alexander may have been pleased that two crows, perhaps sent by the gods, had been on hand in order to show their favor and save his party. Whatever the difficulties of the journey were, Alexander reached the oasis probably in 8 days. The oasis at that time was about 6 miles wide, had a lot of springs, and famous groves of both date palms and olive trees. There also was a unique spring somewhere in the middle of the grove. Our sources tell us that the water of the spring was hot at midnight, but as the day dawned and it grew warmer, it got colder as time passed, reaching its coldest temperature in the very middle of the day. Having reached this grove with its miraculous spring, Alexander set about to visit the oracle. So Alexander was conducted into the sanctuary and gazed upon the god for a while. The priest who held the position of the god's prophet came out and greeted Alexander, saying, "Greetings, O son, take this form of address as from the god also." To which Alexander supposedly replied, "I accept, Father, for the future I shall be called your son." According to Plutarch's sources, however, the priest made a mistake. Because his Greek wasn't very good, he meant to say to Alexander, "O Paideon," which would have meant something like "O son" or "O child" in Greek. But instead, what he said was "O Paideos," which in Greek would mean "O son of God" or "O son of Zeus." And Alexander replied immediately, "I'll take it." So whether the priest made a mistake or not, Alexander seized upon it, and from thenceforth the story grew that the prophet had greeted Alexander as the son of Zeus. Next, according to some of the sources, Alexander asked the priest to ask the god 2 questions on his behalf. The first question was whether he had been given world rule or rule over all of mankind. The second question was whether all of the murderers of Philip had been punished. The priest then presumably went into the sanctuary and put Alexander's questions to the god himself. The god had the form of an omphalos. An omphalos was a large egg-shaped stone. It was encrusted with emeralds. It was carried around by the 80 priests in a boat that had silver bells attached to it, and the boat was followed by a kind of choir of women. So what happened was the prophet would pose the questions to the omphalos being carried in the boat by the priests. Once the questions were posed, the boat would move to the left, to the right, backwards, or forwards. And it was the movements of the boat that provided the answers to the questions. To Greeks accustomed to anthropomorphic forms of gods, that is, statues, the form of Zeus Ammon must have seemed very strange and somewhat exotic, but undoubtedly that was part of its appeal. The priest came back out, and in answer to Alexander's first question, he cried out that the god had granted his request. To the second question, he had a more complex response. He cautioned Alexander to be more guarded in his questions because no one could harm his father. But the murderers of Philip had all been punished. The implication of that answer, therefore, was that Alexander's father had not been mortal. And therefore, maybe Olympias didn't lie when she told Alexander, and perhaps others, that it had not been Philip who had slithered into her bedroom on the night that Alexander had been conceived. The questions that Alexander supposedly asked Zeus Ammon and the answers that he received has always been a source of fascination to classical scholars. Unfortunately, however, no completely contemporary account corroborates that those were exactly the questions and the answers that he got. Rather, the questions and the answers may have been invented or elaborated upon by Callisthenes or Cleitarchus in order to make some points that would be pleasing to Alexander. First of all, that the god said that he'd be given world rule. But even more importantly and more interestingly, the answer to his question about the murderers of his father. Why would Alexander ask such a question? And why would he want that answer spread by his court historian? Essentially, what that question did was to close off the investigation into Philip's assassination. And by the way, of course, it exculpated both Alexander and his mother, Olympias. And there are several historians who believe that the reason why that question and its answer are there in the historical sources is for precisely that reason. And in any case, if you look at the account of the episode in Arrian, whose sources are Ptolemy and Aristobulus, what Arrian says is that Alexander posed his question to the god and got back the answer that his heart desired. That's all he says. No one heard the question that Alexander asked, and no one heard the response. And that may be all that we can truly know about what happened between Alexander and Zeus Ammon. All of that said, there may be some later information that helps us to understand perhaps what went on. Later on, when Alexander reached India and sailed down the Indus River, when he reached the Indian Ocean, Arrian says that he made sacrifices in accordance with the instructions given to him by Zeus Ammon. If we think about the context, therefore, what that may mean is that somehow when Alexander had reached what he believed to be the outer ocean of the world, he made sacrifices that were required of him. And that may help us to understand the kinds of questions that Alexander really did put to Zeus Ammon. We'll come back to that in its own context when we get out to India with Alexander. But whatever question Alexander asked Zeus Ammon, and whatever reply he received, and whatever he thought of himself afterward, he can't have been too unhappy about the experience because we're told that he gave rich gifts to the oracle afterward, before he made his way back to Egypt.